It provides a cultural opportunity for students as well as the community to explore the rich heritage of St. Bernard and the New Orleans area.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, here is your host, Mr. Curtis Mannins.
Greetings, and welcome to the fourth lecture of the season. And in case anybody's wondering, we had to sell the podium to afford the reception tonight. And so hopefully, maybe next time to have a good reception, if I show up without clothes, you'll know what happened. So, right. But just a few things. First off, since the History Lecture Series has grown quite a bit, and has grown more than just being a lecture, but it's become a production with a lot of other things that we'll talk about. And so I'd like to announce a few promotions. Two people who have a great deal to do with the success, probably the vast majority of the success of the lecture series. And so they've been promoted to producers. One is Kathy Cooper, who handles the receptions. And let's give a hand to Cooper. She handles the front of the house, and then Ron Chapman, who's going to give the speech tonight, handles a lot of the history stuff. But he's really done a lot more, responsible for a lot more stuff. So let's give him a hand as well. So. And one of the things in which we've expanded to make it more of a production, more cultural and intellectual entertainment, we had our first high school special presentation. We gave a special lecture for 210 ninth graders, and because at the timing of the History Lecture Series, Monday evening, sometimes it's difficult to reach out to that certain demographic, which is very important for our future and, of course, for Nunez's future. And so it went flawlessly. They had a great time. And so we'll have two more for the 12th graders in March and the 11th graders in April. So I'll tell you more about those things. Looking ahead, we're going to have a little bit of break. So you might go into withdrawal symptoms to the next lecture. The next one is going to be a great one. It's going to be on February 21st. In our planning, of course, how these things always work out, that we plan things and then holidays pop up. They schedule these holidays that conflict with our lectures. All right, so first, of course, we're going to give it on February 7th, but we weren't sure we'd get a great crowd on the Monday before Mardi Gras. No problem. Then we're going to switch it to the next Monday like we always do until we realize that was Valentine's Day. And then we're going to switch it to the next one, and of course that's President's Day, but we didn't want to switch it again. So, all right, so it'll be a great one, but we will have almost 3 months off. If you go into too much withdrawal symptoms, there are going to be some things in early January with the Battle of New Orleans type presentations, and also Ron Chapman, who's giving the speech tonight, is going to be giving a few things around that time. So you can always contact me if you have anything else. One more thing that I feel like that we've kind of grown to be a family, so one personal thing has been quite a day today that's been filled with good news and bad news. So which one would you like first? All right, the good news personally, as of, and this can be our secret, but if you notice me walking a little bit lighter, as of noon today, I have finished my PhD schooling, and so all through with that. So at future lectures, I might not walk through with a zombie-like stare because it's been quite a semester, all right? And then, unfortunately, the bad news, you might have seen that the mascot is not here. The mascot chose the early morning of my proposal defense to make her first visit to the emergency room. So I spent Lonnie, my wife, and I spent from 2:30 a.m. to 6 a.m. in the emergency room. It turned out she just had a rash, which was very serious to first-time parents, but apparently not serious to any doctors or anything. So she's fine, but just a bit under the weather, all right? So with that out of the way, I'd like to go ahead and present Mr. Ron Chapman to give a fascinating lecture that doesn't lend itself well to a title, so I won't even try. We tried a bunch of different ones, but he'll tell you what it's about. And by the way, if he doesn't tell you the story about the naming of the French Quarter streets with the saints, you need to be sure and ask him about it. That's my favorite. So Mr. Ron Chapman.
Thank you. And see, when I grow up and be a big boy like him and get a PhD, I can wear shoes like that too, you see? I was born that way. So, okay, we're going to be talking about the founding of New Orleans. So let's get on with the show. Early contact with the area. In 1682, LaSalle and Tonty passed the future site of New Orleans on the way to the mouth of the Mississippi River. If you remember these two great explorers following Marquette and Juliet, who went only down to the Arkansas River and then turned around and went back up, they came all the way down. And there's some reason to believe that they may have spotted in the distance as they passed the bend in the river, the crescent city, so to speak, the shimmering lake in the background. Following that, in March 1699, Iberville and Bienville viewed the lake in the background of the Mississippi River as they traveled up. What happened is they came in and ostensibly to land at Pensacola, but they found the French knew they were going there, took the area ahead of them, so they ended up having to move further downstream. When they met a native girl, and she told them about the great river Malabanca that was further to the west. So they went up the mouth of the Mississippi River and started working their way upstream, trying to find out if this was really the Mississippi River or not. And in the process of doing so, if you read their journals, you'll discover that they discovered this shimmering lake in the distance. Iberville then, after the two brothers had gone upstream, on their way back down, they still weren't sure if they were in the Mississippi River. So as a result, Iberville and Bienville had a conference, and the older brother, Iberville, decided, look, what I'll do is the Indians are telling me this place called Manchac, which means back way. I'll take this and see where it goes. You go down the mouth of the Mississippi, the river, like you came, and we'll meet up at Ship Island. He follows that course. It brings him into this bayou, brings him into the Amite River to Lake Maurepas to Lake Pontchartrain, and then he goes along, we believe, according to his journals, the southern rim of Lake Pontchartrain, where he first passes Bayou St. John. And interestingly enough, he realizes two things. One, when he places his hands in the water and tastes it, it's brackish, which means it's not the Gulf, but it must be open to it. And second, the mosquitoes are driving him absolutely insane. By the time he gets to Ship Island, within 7 hours, his brother arrives. And they know now that they're at the Mississippi River because when Tonty had come down looking for LaSalle in his lost expedition, he left some letters with the local Alopecia Indians. And he returned with those letters and gave them to his elder brother, which now basically established the fact now that this was indeed the Mississippi River. Later, Iberville goes back home because he's the explorer, he has the contacts in Europe. He goes back home to get resupplied, and his younger brother, Bienville, now decides to go upstream to see how far he can get. He goes and visits the Natchez villages. On his way back down, he sees a British ship. There's some controversy on the name of the captain, whether it's Bonds or Banks, but anyway, it's up against the side of the bank of the river and tied down. What this is, in essence, is an attempt for the British to make their first presence in the Mississippi River and perhaps claim the area. Bienville, in all of his bravado, streams up to the boat in his canoe, climbs up along the side, and informs the captain of the ship that if you look upstream, you're going to discover there's a massive French fleet and fortification awaiting you. I was sent downstream to inform you for your own protection that you had best raise anchor and turn around and go away. I have this image of Bienville climbing back in his canoe, paddling up around and getting behind the reeds and looking to see if his little ploy worked. It did. The British turned anchor and headed away. From this day, that area has been called English Turn. October 15, 1717, then Bienville realizes that he wants to have a presence on the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River drains everything from the Rocky Mountains to the Appalachian Mountains and 3 provinces of Canada, which is where the fur is. They know they have to control this area. They've been doing their settlements up around Mobile, Dauphin Island. They established a little base at Fort de la Boulay at the mouth of the river, but it was continually washed away. And besides, the mosquitoes were horrendous down there. So finally, he decides, after John Law takes control of the colony, which is a story in itself. But anyway, when John Law gets control, Bienville, on October 15, 1717, gets permission from John Law to open a city on the Mississippi River itself. He at that point sends Jacques Barbazan de Pelon to start construction. They named the city Nouvelle-Orléans. This is the area we're talking about here. See if my little arrow works. When they came downriver, Iberville came through this way into Lake Pontchartrain, around the rim, came up here and goes to Ship Island, while Bienville followed the turn all the way down, and came all the way up this way here to Ship Island. When Bienville was coming down the next exploration, at this point here, English turned and he meets the ship. And the reason is, you see this bend, how hard it is? A sailing ship has to have the wind in a comfortable position to let it go. And with this constant turn, there was no way you could do that in one sailing venture, so you'd have to stop along the way and wait for the winds to shift before you could come in. That's what made traveling up the Mississippi River so difficult. First you had to pass the sandbars, then you had to fight the current, then you had to make it through this incredible turn in order to get to this location. Okay? What Bienville realized early on was by having the Mississippi River here, okay, and Lake Pontchartrain here, and listening to his brother Iberville talking about Bayou Saint-Jean, which came in through the back here, this may be the ideal position militarily to control anything that comes down the Mississippi River, while at the same time through Lake Pontchartrain, Lake Borgne, Lake Maurepas, and the Mississippi Sound control all traffic that's on the Gulf. So the finding of the city of New Orleans is more of a military decision than anything else. Now the question comes up, Nouvelle. The city is supposedly named after the Duc d'Orléans, who is a male. Nouvelle is a feminine construction for the word new. Why would you name that? Well, Father Clairvaux, and you have two great sources from this time. One of them is Father Clairvaux, who arrives in 1721, and another is Laplage de Prats, who's actually from Holland, who comes and settles in with Bienville back in the early 1720s. Both of these men did extensive writing, so they're the primary sources we have. Clairvaux writes, "Here I am in this famous city which they call Nouvelle-Orléans. Those who coined the name must have thought Orleans was a feminine gender, but what does that matter? The custom is established, and custom is, above all, the rules of grammar." Now, there's some historians out there who have looked at this thing, and it's not necessarily a consensus, but it's an interesting spin, especially being in the city we're in. Legend has it Duc d'Orléans' father was a known cross-dresser in Louis XIV's court, and it's possible that that's where the Nouvelle comes from. New Orleans. Bienville always favored this spot where the Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain met, simply because Bayou Saint-Jean ran from the Mississippi River just about to where the Beauregard statue is at Esplanade Avenue. There was an Indian portage that worked its way up to the river itself. And in fact, on the second occasion exploring the area, Iberville actually went all the way up the area, went across the natural area that was there, and drank water out the Mississippi River. So Bienville recognized the need for this economic position. He turned to engineer Leblanc de la Tour and said, "Look, this is where I want my city." Leblanc de la Tour disagreed. He said, "You've got to be crazy. This place floods." Hello? Perhaps we should have listened to Leblanc de la Tour. He suggests, "No, let's move up to Manchac." Bienville says, "No, I don't think so. I want it here because it best serves my position." Bienville outranked Leblanc de la Tour, so obviously he took over. It was military and it was an economic decision, not necessarily a decision based upon habitability for the human species. As early as 1716, 10 men lived at the mouth of the Bayou Saint-Jean. Now, the city is not founded until 1718, but Saint-Denis, who is the founder of Natchitoches, which is the first permanent colony in Louisiana, is the one who settles here with a group of Biloxi Indians and starts cultivating. What he does is prove that the ground is suitable for growing things and for living. Later, some other settlements would appear. So actually, before the city is founded, you're going to find a number of settlements appearing up along Bayou Saint-Jean. There's a great little book, which name escapes me right now, on the history of Bayou Saint-Jean, which is an excellent work and gets into detail on these settlements that are developed there. In 1718, finally, Bienville takes 80 salt smugglers. You have to remember that Louisiana, for the most part, is populated by criminals at this time. There are some artisans that are coming in, but for the most part, the French are emptying the city streets, emptying the city prisons. So if you go back and say, well, my families are the very first families from New Orleans, you might not be too proud. But anyway, So they salt smugglers come to the present site of New Orleans, and they start clearing all the cypress trees and clearing all the land. Now, the thing you want to remember, and we'll get into a little bit more detail from this point on, is that the Mississippi River overflows its banks every year. And as it overflowed its banks, this tremendous thrush of fresh water would come down and sediment would settle in. That's what built Louisiana. Louisiana is only, the coastline is only 7,500 years old geographically, to show you how young and how new it is, and also, as we know, how vulnerable it is. Okay? So, what they have is the closer you get to the river, the higher the land, which makes sense because that's the same reason when we're coming back after a heavy storm, we go on St. Bernard Highway and not Judge Perez. We know this. This gives you an idea here of where the city is. This is the coming up the Mississippi River. On a side note, you can see how tragic this is. Look, this is all gone now. Okay? And what they could do is by having a location here, you control Lake Pontchartrain through here, through the Wrigley's, and you also control the Mississippi River. So it's a strategic military decision more than it is anything else. This is another view of much the same thing. This, by the way, is our wonderful little friend, Mr. Go. That's just about wiped us out as a people. Over here you can see the hint of Bayou St. John coming up. In this bend here is the city. So you can see if you brought goods in this way and stopped them here, which is where you didn't have to fight the currents, you could then offload them into small boats, bring them into the Bayou St. John as far as it would go. From Bayou St. John, then you would load them onto carts and bring them up, which is in essence right around Esplanade Avenue to the back of the city, and supply the city that way. Then you could take anything that was coming down the Mississippi River, all the furs and everything else coming from the French colonies further north, load them up here as well, then take them out to sea. So you can see the purpose for New Orleans being where it is. Early troubles. In the beginnings, the settlement was extremely humble. Few people lived there. Life was very sparse. I don't know if you all have gone to museum days out here in the Islanos community. If you haven't, I suggest you do. If you have, I suggest you think about the palmetto huts. That's what these people are living in. So they really aren't, they're camping, is in essence what they're doing. Survival, the real game. In 1719, a hurricane comes and wipes the settlement out. So they're there for 1 year when they suffer this desertation. You'd think you might get the hint. But no. In 1720, another engineer, because after all, since Leblanc de la Tour and Bienville were disagreeing, he turned to another engineer by the name of André Pauger, and they drew up a plan for the new city. And the idea was to have drainage ditches dug, a low levee constructed across the front, and a small church and some government buildings up in the front. Now, the interesting thing here is in the French and Spanish way of designing a city, and if any of you all have ever been to Europe, you know what they have, they call the city centrum. Everything is in the center of the city, and it's like an onion with layers around the outside. That probably would have been the idea for New Orleans, the only difficulty being the land was highest by the river, and it kind of soon became a swamp behind there. So they had to take what was called the city centrum and push it up close along the river. And that's why you have the arrangements you have right now with the cathedral and the Place d'Armes right on the levee there. In 1721, a 5-day storm came and destroyed everything again. It's kind of like an Etch-a-Sketch, wipes everything away. First years are hard. But they survived. They continue working. They keep trying to build their community. In 1721, New Orleans had a population of 370 persons. You have 147 men, 65 women, 38 children, 28 servants, 73 slaves, and 21 Indians. The Indians were probably to some extent slaves, but the interesting thing to look at is the number of slaves that you have here. Because you're going to find that it's going to take on the backs of slaves, a lot of the slaves are going to provide the labor that are going to build the city of New Orleans structurally. In 1722, 2 hurricanes came and devastated the city. We don't seem to learn from experience, do we? Okay. They rebuilt the city. This time they figured, well, you know, instead of palmetto huts, maybe we ought to go with something a little bit more substantial. Kind of like the 3 pigs. So to have a church facing the river, we'll set a rectory on the left, we'll build a guardhouse to the right, we'll set the Place d'Armes in front, and the city plan will expand it now to make it a little bit bigger than it had been before. The design they come up with is what is today's Ville Carré, the old square. This is the city of New Orleans. This is his first plan. His first plan was actually just 4 by 10 blocks. That was about it. Interesting thing here, this must be an older picture, actually, because you see the river, because it's interesting to go by the river names. It flew to Mississippi, so they're calling it the Mississippi River. So even though the drawing is done as one of the earliest drawings of Polgar, when the copy is made, it's done later because the river's name has been settled upon. 1724 map, you can see he's included now. The city is 6 blocks by 11 blocks. But if you look here, the name has changed. It is now Flux del St. Louis. They named it St. Louis Cathedral, St. Louis River, St. Louis Forts. Everything was named after St. Louis, the King of France. Basic components. His first plan was 10 blocks by 4. His later plan decided to make the city a little bit bigger, 11 by 6. In all the plans that are designed, the city is located in the center. The rectory and guard flank it, and the Place d'Armes in front. The purpose of the Place d'Armes is that's where you would call your military together. They would do their exercises, they would do their performances, they would do their training. Okay? Behind the church, this is interesting, was the main street. So when you think about it, that's why it's called Orleans. And it's called Orleans because Louis XIV had died, the great Sun King. Louis XV had taken over. He was a young man, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere around 6 years old. So they had a regent who would rule in his place. He was named the Duc d'Orléans. This is under John Law's company because John Law the Duke was broke. So what he did was he turned to this guy named John Law who had this marvelous idea about paper money, kind of like Enron. But anyway, that's another later story. But anyway, we get into who've been broke a number of times. This isn't the first. So in any event, they named the street behind the cathedral, which was supposed to be the main street, Orleans Avenue, Orléans, after him because he was the regent. Okay? It was wider than the rest of the city, by the streets, by about 7 feet, and it directly divided the city. The first church, remember we're not a cathedral at this time, is the St. Louis Church. It's a wooden structure. So this is what they seem to perceive, based upon the plans, what the first church looked like, and it was dedicated in 1724. Street names. Now, John Law depended upon the support of his major investors. And as anybody out here who's ever developed property knows, you get a bunch of investors together, you buy the property, and then when it comes down to putting in the sewage and putting in, it costs you money to develop. When it comes down to naming things, you start naming the streets after people that helped invest. Or in the case of like Fred Segura, since you bought in a marsh, you might as well name it after the animals that lived there that you displaced. If you start dealing with the cross from the battlefield of New Orleans, you name them like Keene, Gibbs, Thornton, Jackson, all the battles, the main people who participated in the Battle of New Orleans. It's up to the developer to name the streets what he wishes to name them. The company needed the continued blessing of the royal family, and it needed the continued blessing of the Duc d'Orléans. And to honor these investors in the royal family, Polgar and Bienville get together, and they look at this map that they've drawn out, and they start giving them names. They've got to name the streets here. But you have a problem. Some of these people really don't like each other. I mean, they're related, but they don't like each other. The Duc d'Orléans has now taken a position where he is overseeing the entire estate, but there's the Duc de Toulouse and the Duc de Domaine, who also have genetic ties, and we'll get into that in a little bit, to the royal family. They're considered potential pretenders to the throne or threats to the throne, so there's a lot of court intrigue going on. However, they are all investors in the company of John Law, the Mississippi Company, so as a result, somehow we've got to put all these people together in this mix, but somehow not offend anyone. So this now becomes a bit of a puzzle for the developers. So in naming the streets, Bienville and Polgar had to exercise the greatest care, and as you can imagine with Frenchmen, not to offend anyone. So, how do they resolve the conflicts? Isn't this a wonderful cartoon? That's John Chase. I mean, here you have the Duke d'Orleans in the middle, with the widest street, by the way, because he's the guy who is the most powerful, arguing with the Duc de Maine and the Duc de Toulouse, and we have these saints all around them. This is really an interesting cartoon because it tells the truth. What happens? Naming of streets, as I said, was not an easy matter. The Duc d'Orléans required special attention. Two other important investors were the Duc de Toulouse and the Duc de Maine. These were the illegitimate sons of King Louis XIV. King Louis XIV set up the Tuileries, the Hall of Mirrors. He and Madame de Montespan had a wondrous affair and produced numerous illegitimate children. As a consequence, they still had royal blood flowing through their veins, so you could see where the problems were there as far as rules concerned. So with that the case, and they hated one another, how are you going to resolve it? Polgar looks at the situation. What he decides to do is to say, well, you know, why don't we insulate them? So if you think for a moment about electricity with rubber around the outside to insulate it, what you do is you take your street names that you name Orléans, Domaine, and Toulouse, and you insulate them by putting saints in between them. And that way they don't actually touch. They don't actually have contact with one another. In this way, they could get the support of everybody and not create a controversy. So as a result, this is the kind of street names you end up with. First, you have Barrack Street. The French called it Rue de Quartier, because that's basically where the troops had been quartered at the time when they were here. It later becomes Barrack Street when it's Americanized because it's a barracks. A lot of thought there. The British called it Calais Douana. The next is Rue de Arsenal, because that's where you had your arsenals. There's a lot of imagination put into laying out these streets here. It was named originally Rue de Saint-Adrien, then it's Rue de Arsenal, and finally it's changed to Ursuline Street, because when the Ursuline nuns come in, they have such a tremendous impact on the community. Not only are they providing and educating the young women that are coming into the community, but they are the first medical care that's available. Okay? So when the nuns have such a tremendous impact, they say, oh, let's just name it Ursuline's Avenue. So that's how that name gets there. St. Philip, the next one down, is the famous baptismal name of the Orléans family. Philip, the Duc d'Orléans, was a regent. His first name was Philip, so you kind of throw that in there. Because each one of these people were named after a saint. That's the whole point. Domaine was Duc Domaine. So we tend to look at it as one word, but it really was a Duc Domaine. He was another illegitimate son by Madame de Montespan. So you put a saint, and then you put Duc Domaine, and then you put another saint in. St. Anne. Favorite female baptismal name of the Orleans family. St. Anne was Mary's mother, as we know. Then we come to Rue de Orléans, which is the main street. Right now it's kind of a backwater, but at the time it was expected, being behind the cathedral and being a little bit wider than the rest, that it would become the main street. It was actually 45 feet wide. Following that, we come immediately with another saint, St. Peter, named after the ancestor of the House of Bourbon, which was the ruling family of France. Now we can come up with the other legitimate son, the second son of Louis XIV and Madame de Montespan, Toulouse. Toulouse, but you can play with that if you thought about it for a second. And then you have St. Louis, in remembrance of Louis IX, who's the Saint King of France, a famous 13th century crusader. Most St. Louis Cathedral, St. Louis River, most of the time the references are really to him, not to all the other 18 Louis. This is the one that most of the references are to. You finally have Comte, who's another illegitimate son, but he's not close enough to be of any real consequence or threat to the crown. And then finally you have Bienville, named for this founder of the city. It's not going to be too much later before Iberville is added into this. So, that having been done, now let's go the other way with the street names. The first one is Rue de Quay, which is also known as Levee Street. Why? Well, because there was a levee there. Like I said, there's not a lot of imagination. It abutted the Mississippi River levee, which was built, but in 1870 it was changed in honor of Stephen Decatur, the naval hero at the Battle of Tripoli. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Marine Corps theme. That's how it fits in. Chartres was named for the Duc de Chartres. It was a title possessed by the Orleans family. That's why they put Chartres in. Royal, also Chartres, for a while in front of the church was called Church Street, but then it went back to Rue de Chartres after that. Royal was originally named by both Iberville and Bienville, and Polgar, Royal Bourbon, in honor of both the royal family and the dynasty. But then Bienville got to thinking about it. He says, well, no, let's make one of them Royal and the other one Bourbon. The Bourbon is named as the House of Bourbon, which is the ruling family's name. It's not named after the alcohol which flows so plentiful on the street today, which I'm sure most tourists probably figure, what a great name for a street, you know, that you get drunk on, but not realizing there's really no connection whatsoever. Dauphine is kind of interesting. It's originally believed to be Dauphin. The Dauphin is the eldest son of the King of France. However, it's got an E on it, which then makes it feminine, which raises another issue, and I think it's possibly the Dauphine's wife, or perhaps it's relating to an area in France called Dauphiné. We really don't know exactly where Dauphine's origins come from. And then finally you have Burgundy, named after the Duke of Burgundy. So you can see what they're doing is the names they're giving to the streets of the original Vieux Carré are named after individuals who are major investors in John Law's company in Mississippi, but arranged in such a way as to not get these people who hate one another angry with one another because their streets are close to one another or intersecting one another. Other famous streets come in. Esplanade. Esplanade was the site of a parade ground. That's what the esplanade means. It was an area where people walked. It's where soldiers could drill. It's where people entertained themselves. They picnicked and such the like as that. It was on its way to the original Indian portage, and if you figure you take Esplanade and you walk down, where do you hit? Bayou St. John. So that was the natural levee, the natural high spot of the bayou that was there. The next is Rampart, which is interesting. A lot of people don't realize that New Orleans, unlike many of the cities in the United States, was medieval in the sense it had a fort built around it. And the walls of a fort are called ramparts. And so the outside wall of the fort was the rampart, so you were going back by the rampart. So when the ramparts came down and the walls of the fort came down, the area where the walls occupied was called Rampart Street, because that's what people had come in common to calling it. Canal Street. Now this is interesting, because originally when they laid it out, I mean, the city was wet. The city was a mess, because every time the river overflowed, it just flooded everything. And if you can imagine, if you will, you really had no sewage systems, you had no water systems. So what they did was they dug these canals around each one of the blocks, and they just filled up with raw sewage, they filled up with garbage, they filled up with everything you can imagine. And when it rained, you hoped that there was enough rain to flood it out, but not enough rain to make it overflow and kind of get into everybody's houses and all over the place. New Orleans had a distinct gentoo, should we say. So canal was one of the canals that ran along the side of the city. However, around the early 1800s, there was a movement to actually dig a canal there, a navigation canal, right to the Mississippi River and connect it to the lake. It's kind of good they didn't do it, because the idea of locks hadn't set in at that point. There's two different water levels there, so there's no telling what disaster would have ensued had they accomplished that task. It goes on for years, and like all other studies, a lot of money is spent on it. Not a shovel of dirt is ever actually pulled out, but what we get out of it is one of the widest streets in the United States. It's 170 feet wide, because it was designed as a navigation canal in the center, open area on either side, roads on either side, clearing on either side, streets. Then you'd have your buildings set back. When none of that was developed, you ended up with this street that is 170 feet wide, which I believe is the widest thoroughfare in the United States. Then we come to the term the neutral ground, which I'm sure we've all heard about. Some debate this, whether it's true or not, but I'm inclined to think it's true, because what happened, the area was French, the area was Spanish. When the Spanish took over from the French, there was a revolution, in fact, for a little while there. But they got over it, and after they got over that, then the Americans started coming in, and they really didn't get over that. So they moved the Americans, basically settled in what was called Faubourg Saint-Maurice, which was across Canal Street. And when the Americans came into the Creole section, sometimes they would be challenged to things like duels and what have you, and neither side liked one another that well, so they created what's called the neutral ground, which was between them. And in fact, I think when you get to 1837, the city has three governments, one in Faubourg Saint-Maurice, one in the old French Quarter, and another one down which is around Faubourg Marigny. So we didn't always get along. We still don't sometimes. Banquets are basically what happened when they dug out these canals around all the blocks, and all that slush and mud was running in. They piled up the mud, and they basically took boards and laid boards on top. And a banquet is a French term for a little bridge. And what you'd have to do is kind of walk down that little bridge as best you could. And you can imagine if you fell, well, you can't want to imagine if you fell, what you would fall into. So that's where the term banquet came in, because it was these little bridges that would be used, a small bench, they called it, that you could walk to stay dry. The first cemetery was built on Paugus Plan on St. Peter Street. But they had a problem, and now you'll see it a little bit later when I get into the elevations of the city, because as you got to the back of the city, it became progressively wet. It was a swamp. So what they would have to do is when they would dig a hole to bury somebody, they discovered that to get the casket down, they would stand on it and wait for it to fill up with water until it sunk. And then they would try to put the mud on top to hold it down. That didn't really work that well, so then they started boring holes in the bottom of the casket so the water could really get in. And then they could throw them in and they could step on it real quick or just hold it down with their shovels. And you don't want to imagine what's taking place inside, you know. And they shovel this thing down and it fills up with water and it's ballasted down. And while one guy holds the shovel keeping it under, the rest of them start pouring mud on top. It doesn't take too long for them to realize this really isn't a delicate way of doing away with the deceased and loved ones. So then they start building the tombs above ground. But New Orleans lacks rock. New Orleans is mud. So as a result, what they have to do is build bricks with the mud that they have, which is relatively soft. It erodes very easily with the rain and the moisture and the wind and everything else we have. So they have to cover it with stucco to protect it. And that's why you'll find the homes, and you'll also find the cemeteries are all built with the stucco. And then on what am I thinking of? All Saints' Day, they would come out and they would clean up the cemeteries and re-stucco them and repaint them and paint them white and whitewash them and all that. That's where the tradition comes across. It's not just something you do for fun. It was something that you had to do that was essential to maintain the cemeteries. This is an example right here of it. And it's really great, you see, because these people are dining. You know, they'll have picnics out there. Here, if you notice what they do here, they wouldn't actually put seal the tomb. They would have these little braces here with curtains, and they would slide the casket in into the curtains out of delicacy. And when the people left, then they would remove this, and then they would put in, you know, seal it with the marble slab. It's as much the same thing taking place here. You can see them up here. These are all the widows, and these are people taking care of the land. This was the French market. At that time, you started having the beginnings of the French market at this point, but you had no regulations until really the Spanish start coming in under Ulloa and basically under O'Reilly. And it was notoriously bad, too. I remember I spent some time in Panama one time and was at a meat market, which was kind of amazing because the meat's just hanging on a hook with flies all over it. And if you pick out what you want, he chases the flies off, cuts what he wants, throws the newspaper, wraps it up, and hands it to you. No refrigeration. So you can imagine what this was like, because you got fish and everything, and they're cleaning, and they're just throwing it in the gutter. Okay, so the French market was notorious for its aroma. Now, New Orleans in its early years. This is John Chase's view. And it's really, I love John Chase. I mean, people think of him as a cartoonist, but he wrote many books, actually 6 historical works, and a 7th, which we can't seem to locate. He was in the last chapter when he passed away, and nobody knows what happened to the manuscript. But here you can see his Bayou St. John running down. Here's the Portage running into the back of the city. Here's Bayou Bienvenue. Here's Bayou Sauvage at Gentilly. Here's Chapatula. Metairie Road here, which is all, Metairie Road, by the way, and Gentilly are all along the bed of the bayous, because the bayous were much like the river. The land was higher there. You can see swamp, 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 and cypress forest. So we've been building in a swamp for a long time here. This here is rather interesting because it took me a while to figure out what this was all about, but apparently they had a real controversy when people's donkeys died. Nobody bothered to move them. So it became a bit of an issue of how are we going to get these dead animals out the street. And figure also there weren't any regulations about the animals' well, natural processes. Nobody bothered to clean it up. So the city was, had its own aroma. This is very interesting because under the French system, the French developed what was called the long lot system. That's where the term arpit comes in. Arpit, if I'm not mistaken, is 192.82 feet wide. And what they would do, and this plays an important role, so pay a little bit of attention to this, they would take the river, okay, and you would purchase so many arpits across the frontage of the river, and then the land went all the way back, usually to the 40 arpit position. That's where the term the 40 arpit canal comes in. So this is some of the original layouts of the city. You can see the very first developments were really along Bayou St. John before the city is built. Here the city has the forts mounted along its sides. And these are the properties that are being sold in a long lot system. What's going to evolve out of this, and I'll show you later, is that the derangement of the city by being a fan shape is a direct relationship to the way the land was developed under the plantation system. This is a fascinating map because what this shows you here, this is the Mississippi River, right here. The high area you see is high. Then it gets low, then it gets real low. This here is basically Basin Street. That's where the new, well, not the new basin, but the Carondelet Canal used to be. Okay? So you can see as development, and I'll show you, is going to take place. Development is going to take place close along the river and more upstream from the river. This is a map that's really undated, but it's very primitive. But you can see here again is Flou de Saint Louis. So it's named after St. Louis. You have a ship docked here. You have an open park area here. Here you have your church, your Place d'Armes, and here you have your plats of land. Here you have a little windmill out here, and this is where they store the gunpowder, which is a good idea to keep it outside the city. And over here are your bayous, but you can see the bayous really don't seem to be an accurate portrayal. So this is more of a fantasy map. But what you do notice is all the cypress trees back here. This was all in cypress all around here. Latour's map of 1720, he's confused because you have the River St. Louis, but then it's got called by the natives the Mississippi and the Mississippi. So he's put all three names of the river on it. He's trying to decide, they don't know exactly at this name which name they're going to go with. But again, if you look at it, the city here, these are only the first 4 blocks he's got in here, and the development has taken place more upstream than downstream. 1723 map, again, more upstream than downstream. Here's the church, the St. Louis Church. There's the Place d'Armes. 1720 St. Louis or Mississippi. So they're getting close. You know, they almost settled on the name by 1728. And again, as you can see is the layout of the streets now. You can see this is the French Quarter. This is Orleans Avenue running directly behind. You see all the rest of the blocks are square. This one, Orleans bisects that square. And you can see how the lots are made. They're long this way with key lots on the inside here. And that's how the whole thing's developed, except for those who had enough money to buy larger chunks of property. The city had forts around it. Fort St. Charles, Fort St. Louis, Fort St. Joseph, Fort Ferdinand, and Fort Burgundy. The last one to come down would be Fort St. Charles, and that's at the site of the present mint. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, at the point when Louisiana became American and Pierre Lassat demanded the keys of the city, Salcedo didn't know what to do, so the only thing he had was an old rusty set of keys to the fort. She said, "Here, take this." He said, "Okay, I'll accept it." This here is showing the city with the fort layout superimposed over an existing map. This here line here is what we now call Common Street, and the reason is this area here in between was called the Commons because they didn't want anything developed in this area, because if the city was attacked, they needed the open area to protect themselves, so somebody wouldn't have a chance to attack them by hiding behind anything. So that's where the term Commons comes from. In 1788 and 1794, you had 2 tremendous fires. One of them wiped out over 800 buildings, the other 200. You know, one of them was started, most unfortunately, when you had, it was Good Friday when the fire started, and the Catholic Church wouldn't allow them to ring bells because you don't ring bells during Good Friday, so they couldn't set out the fire alarm. So before people realized what had happened, most of the city had burned down. The Ursuline nuns at that time grabbed the statue of Our Lady of Prompt Succor and prayed to her, hoping to spare the rest of the city. And indeed, the wind did change, shift, and blow the embers back in the direction it had come. That's why if you go to Our Lady of Prompt Succor Church and you look at the stained glass in the back, you'll see 2 images. One of them is the city on fire, and the other is Andrew Jackson, because that's the 2 occasions when the Ursuline nuns turned to Our Lady of Prompt Succor, asking her help and interceding with God to bring about a miracle. And indeed, a miracle took place. But what comes out of this, though, it's under the Spanish regime, because the Spanish take over the city in 1762. Actually, well, between 1762 and 69, they took it over legally in 62. It didn't send anybody until 67 and didn't gain control until 69. But that's another story. But in the process, what happens is when the Spanish come in, they impose a building code that requires bricks, slate roofs, or Spanish tile roofs. So that's why the French Quarter looks Spanish, because the architecture is actually Spanish, with the wrought iron, the arches, the whole process. It's because most of what was there, except for Madame John's Legacy, is one of the few old buildings, I think, that's from the, and that in the blacksmith shop, are the last 2 buildings that were there. This is a painting in 1803, and interestingly enough, after the fire, Almanasta built a new cathedral, and that's what the new cathedral looks like at that time. You know, you don't find the modern view of the cathedral until it was renovated another time in 1850. But this is coming down here to Elysian Fields. So this is basically what Elysian Fields look like. This is probably a corner of the Marigny Plantation right here. Okay, New Orleans develops. This is a fascinating map. What this shows is the different dates and shows how the city develops. The earliest development actually is in 1708. That's when St. Denis is there. That's when some of the earliest colonies start settling at the bayous. Next it comes to 1722 when you start developing in the area of the actual Ville Carré. It then moves upriver 1788 and you get 1817 and you can see it's like an onion as at different levels. Look at 1949. This is 1920. But look at 1949. This is 1835. This is when the Americans started really flowing in. You can see some of the plantations now. Some of them are still plantations. Some are being broken down and developed. This is the 40-Orpet Canal line, which will actually be Claiborne Avenue. Okay? We're also now starting to move downriver, because this will be the Dunois plantation, working its way down. Vaudreuil will have a plantation. So we're gradually getting along the riverfront, moving our way towards St. Bernard Parish. This is where I grew up, you know, which is part of 1949. This is this is elevations. Now, you know, when you talk about hurricanes and we talk about, you know, the bowl effect and all that, this should keep you awake at night. This is the levee. The green, if you look at the elevation, 17 to 40 feet. This green area, this blue area here is the Mississippi River levee. Okay? This area is built up a bit more here, because this is a batch that was added to the Mississippi River during the colonial period. Because the Mississippi adds to the slow side, to the inside of a curve, and cuts away from the outside of a curve. Okay? Then as you see, it goes from green, it goes to light blue, which is 7 to 8 feet above sea level. Then we get 5 to 6 feet above sea level. This is 0. And then you start getting down in some of these areas here where you're like 4 and 5 feet below sea level. Okay? And if you look at this thing, you're going to see this area here and this area here are old Bayou Gentilly and Bayou Metairie. That's why people always run to mid-city for the high ground, because that's where those two bayous came together, and the ground is indeed a lot higher there, simply because those two bayous, much like the Mississippi River, would overflow and drop their sediment and create high land. This is a fascinating picture here, because this is another elevation view, and you can see the white showing the highland. This again shows Bayou Gentilly, Bayou Metairie, and you can see the hollows beneath. This here shows how black that is. This is way below sea level. This is taken around 1700, and if you notice, the lake shore used to just run right into the water. It was low, so everything dug channels, and the water just ran into the lake. It wasn't until around you got to the 1720s, and we're going to revisit this picture in a little bit, the 1920s, mid-1920s, that they decided to build a seawall about a half a mile out in the lake and then backfill it. That's why if those of us who remember Pontchartrain Beach and the lighthouse, remember our grandmothers telling us, you know, that used to be in deep water, you know, because it was. But then when they filled it in, it actually ended up in land. It became kind of a thing you lean against to take pictures when you went to Pontchartrain Beach. But what this does is, in that effect, look at what you got. You got high land here, you got high land here, and you got low land in the middle. Looks like a bowl. This will give you a picture here. These are the streets here that are technically above sea level, and these are the streets that are below sea level. So find where you live, and look at your insurance policies. This here is a fascinating map. It's out of a book, is New Orleans as It Is, I believe is the name of it. The river itself, a lot of people aren't aware, the river itself sometimes runs up to over 350 feet deep, which is phenomenal. And what this says, this is an elevations map. And if you see, you have letters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and 7, okay? And you have A, B on each one. So what you do is if you go to 1, which is right here, you look at this elevation and you can literally see the elevations, you see? And if you go to 2, which is right here, and you look at the elevations here, but you notice something? Here's a high, There's a high, that's the bowl we're talking about. When this thing fills up with water, that's where the water's going to be. When you get over this way to number 6, you see this here? That's the industrial canal levee. That's why when Hurricane Betsy came, Lower Ninth Ward and Chalmette, St. Bernard flooded, but it didn't get into the city because of this levee system, which this is based on current models. It was lower than that, but it was still substantial. But you can see how high it is. This here is an effective barrier. Right here. That's the industrial canal to keep any floodwaters from coming in from St. Bernard from the southeast direction into the city of New Orleans. This here shows the actual river here. This is the last one, number 7, and you can see how deep the river is just from down here. You know, like I said, it's over 350 feet deep. That's rain. This is probably taken from around the early 1800s. You can see people are up to their knees in water. Ladies are standing on the bank trying to figure out, do I really want to venture out? Will some gentleman carry me? Now this is an interesting document here. The Mississippi River is dynamic. Now that we've locked it in with borders the way we have in levees, it doesn't move like it used to. It used to swirl like a snake. But this whole piece of land here, this line here is basically where the Mississippi River was here, this yellow line, when Bienville founded the city. Then over here, around 1820s, all this land had been deposited by the Mississippi River. Then this was added in again by 1998. What they've done is now that they've seriously levied it off, it's not building up, and they've protected it here so it's not cutting away here. But this whole land here was extensive litigation because being new land, to whom did it belong? Did it belong to the community as public lands, which most people thought, and they stayed there and lived on it and played on it? Or did it belong as an extension of the property that was owned by the individuals who owned the plantations? Whoops, we lost something here. Jack, can you help me out? Thank you. Okay, so you'll see this whole area is Edward Livingston, the guy Bob Livingston who's brought us to Louisiana Purchase, and his young grand whatever who just had to leave Congress under a cloud, you know, all part of the family. Yeah, Edward Livingston was the attorney who handled this case for many, many years, and he finally was able to settle it out to the landowners, but it was an extensive case. All the way went to the Supreme Court. This here shows the fan shape of the city of New Orleans, the map, okay? I know we always talk about why isn't it just a normal grid like anywhere else? Because if you're driving down, for instance, Rampart Street, suddenly you end up on St. Claude, then you suddenly end up on St. Bernard Highway. And if you're telling somebody from out of town how to get to Chalmette, they keep thinking, how can I be driving straight and be on 3 different streets? You know, there's a reason for that. And if you look at this streets, this fan, these lines designate actually the original property lines of the long lot French system. This will show you how it worked, you see. These are the original property owners: Faubourg-Solin, Duplancher, La Course, Annonciation, Liverday. The Liverday family owned property up there at one time. So these people own these plantation strips, and then the roads between them would be developed, and then eventually as they sold the plantation out, what they would do is cut cross streets to join with this cross street to the one that was developed, and that's how you end up with this fan system. It's a direct outgrowth of the French system. This is an overview of the whole thing, and if you look at this, this is St. Claude Avenue and the Industrial Canal, this is Claiborne Avenue running all the way down. That was the limit of your 40-arpent canal when all the plantations were existent at this point in time. So now you get a feeling for the way the city developed as a direct outgrowth of the plantation system. This is an interesting shot here because taking goods and bringing them up Lake Pontchartrain and then loading them off of boats and then putting them into little boats and going up Bayou St. John and then offloading them off of that and putting them into carts and bringing them in. They said, this is kind of silly. So under the Spanish, Carondelet decided what he would do is build a canal that ran from Bayou St. John all the way down to the base of the city and put a turning basin at the end of it where the ships could make a turn around the smaller boats and they could go all the way back out and go all the way down here so you could stop that whole land level transportation process. It lasted for a while, but it pretty quickly became just filled with filth and growth, and you could only get pirogues in and out of it. It stayed for a while until it was finally destroyed and filled in. If you go here up around Mercy Hospital, you can still see where it was because everything grew up around it because it was a canal. And now that even though the canal's been filled in, you can almost see the scar on the landscape where it was. If you look at this picture here, which is really fascinating down here, this is kind of earlier on. This is 1940. This is the remains of Storyville, because that's where Storyville was, at the end of Basin Street, and you had the rail car. This is the rail cover here. The rails used to come in here, and the visitors to Storyville would come up around Mahogany, Varl, and Anderson's Place and all of that. That was later taken down, and it became the Iberville Projects up in here, and a canal was filled in. But that's how Basin Street got its name. Early 20th century improvements. The main thing we always had was water. How are you going to contend with water? So after 2 centuries, finally decided on a means of draining the city. Initially, they came up with a number of plans. A number of companies went bankrupt, and they came up with this idea. It was kind of funny almost, these gigantic paddle wheels that would paddle the water out and paddle it up. They could only raise it about 2 or 3 feet into a canal. Finally, Albert Baldwin Wood developed what's called the screw pump to replace the paddle wheels. And his pumps are still in existence today. And he not only built pumps here, he built pumps around the world. In Cairo, he built them in Paris, I believe. He built them all over the place because it was an ingenious idea. All he did was adapt Archimedes' screw pump to the process. The next big thing was, as I had mentioned earlier, was extending the Lake Pontchartrain. This is basically a model of the screw pump that he designed, okay? An incredible amount. This is the size of a man. And what it would do is suck the water up, run it through the screw pump, and into a basin canal on the other side. This is him standing in front of his pumps. This is the same picture I showed you before, going back to the fact that the next thing that was done around that same period was building this levee system. And once you had done that, then you could start pumping out this land here, drying it up, and that's why on an earlier scale you could see how development was following. Problem is, it's like a sponge. You suck the water out of a sponge, what does it do? It sinks. So in the process of sucking the water out through this drainage system, we've been lowering the land, and New Orleans has been sinking more and more and more, and that's what makes it so vulnerable to a storm. This here shows the lakefront in its early years as it was developed, with plans for subdivisions. This is how it looked in 1952, if you all remember the air base that was stationed there from the Second World War. I grew up somewhere around Elysian Fields, right around here. I remember the Blue Angels used to fly over my house as a child when I was 6, 7 years old. And then down here is a more modern 1998. You can see the University of New Orleans and the filling in, how it's moved. But this is just in, basically 1 century. It's just how much, 75 years, how it's grown. This here is a view from Chalmette. This is the Chalmette battlefield. This is Kaiser. This is the Chalmette slip looking towards the city of New Orleans. This is the Vauqueray right here. St. Bernard Parish. The first land grant that developed St. Bernard Parish was 1721. In 1740, Frenchmen then started moving in and settling along the riverfront. French Governor Vaudreuil basically owned a plantation on the site of what is now the Lebeau plantation. His old home was torn down when they built Lebeau. And thank God they're now trying to save Lebeau, because New Orleans at this time, or Louisiana at this time, under concession of Bernard de Marigny, Slanos moved in initially under Galvez. They were farmers. They took their oxen, and there's all the stories of them bringing their food and all to market and taking their food back out of market again, by their oxen. Later, when sugar was really found in 1790s, right here in Chalmette, by the way, Manuel Solis is the first one who cultivated sugar. All of a sudden, the area became sugar plantations. It was named San Bernardo in 1784. Prior to that, it was known La Concepcion. By the 19th century, it was nothing but sugar plantations. So if you sit down and you can close your mind's eye and remove the refineries and remove the sugar refinery and everything else that's out there, picture, if you will, a levee, a river road running right alongside of it, and a series of plantations running from the river all the way to the back into the cypress swamp with a 40-arpent canal running behind it for drainage purposes to drain the land, and it was all sugar. That's how it was at the time of the Battle of New Orleans, okay? Eventually, Italian immigrants would start moving into the area, and they would start opening up their farms. What's doing its in now is, this is the area here that we're talking about. It's developed. They then built the wonder of wonders in 1957, the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet. This was supposed to shift the traffic from here as a 76-mile run. This would all be highly developed. Believe me, they promised us that we would live like kings here. We'd all be very wealthy from the development that took place. The 500-foot wide canal is now 2,000 feet wide, and a 40,000-acre cypress swamp has been completely destroyed as a result of it. This here is just a map showing here, because I want to talk for a second about our vulnerability when we talk about storms. You now know the elevations of the city of New Orleans, why the bowl effect exists, and how it exists. And we know that when storms come in and they circulate around, they drive the water into this area here, and if they come close enough and they pass north, that wind passing down from the north then takes all the water that's accumulated here, pushes it over the levee at Lake Pontchartrain, along the south edge of Lake Pontchartrain, pushes it down that area and into the city itself. This here is showing you some of the hurricanes that have passed. A lot of people think that Betsy hit right at us, but it really didn't. This is Hurricane Betsy right down here, you see? But we were in the northeast quadrant of it. It went basically through Sorrento. This is the killer hurricane, track A. One coming through this direction here is the one that'll basically do the city in. So you sit down and you say, well, yes, but what are the chances of that happening? Well, pretty good. So you can see the potential for real damage here. And if you go back, this is just looking at some of the past storms, 1831, it's even worse than that. It's like a black line that goes right through it. So it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. So motivations. The French needed to establish a permanent base at the mouth of the Mississippi because they wanted to maintain control of the whole valley. That's why the French came here. As the further west they went with their fur trading, it was harder to get goods through portage into the east, so floating it down the Mississippi would accomplish that goal. Iberville and Bienville recognized that this one point, this one location where the Mississippi River was so close to Lake Pontchartrain and was joined by Bayou St. John, was the ideal place to do it. It satisfied the military imperative of controlling the Mississippi River and the Gulf Coast. So it wasn't settled here because it's a great place for people to live. It was settled here because it satisfied a totally different directive. The first years were hard, but they persisted. But nevertheless, by 1724, the city had taken root and very soon thereafter became the capital of the Orleans colony. 286 years later, today, New Orleans realized the hopes of its founders had become a prosperous port city. However, following the Civil War, the boom days ended because when the steam engine came in and steamboats came around, all of a sudden all that rich cotton and all the goods from up north could be put on steam and driven down to New Orleans and right past our doorstep. We were the biggest boom town you can possibly imagine, rivaling New York, some arguing actually surpassing New York. But as the steam engine was refined and developed, locomotives were invented, all of a sudden that traffic shifted east-west. And especially became east-west when the Civil War took place because the Union under Abraham Lincoln, who by the way was a railroad attorney, recognized the advantage of rail traffic, and as a result most of the trade shifted away from us. And that was the beginning. So the steam engine was kind of the yin and the yang of Louisiana in that it created New Orleans as a great port, ingress and outgress with steam power, and it destroyed Louisiana because it provided an alternate means of trade outside of the river system. Okay? So although rich in history, culture, and people, for a variety of reasons, New Orleans has lost its original economic advantage. The struggle today is to find a new place in the new economy if we can survive the threats of nature. Because if you remember, when Hurricane Ivan came, it was a little bit frightening to have weathermen refer to New Orleans as Atlantis. Because if I'm not mistaken, wasn't that a lost continent? So thank you very much. I hope you found it a little bit informative and interesting.
Let's give Mr. Chapman another hand. Very good. I'll try it for 1 second. Let me just...
I want you also to note the shoes.
As long as we don't get it on film, so my wife won't be too embarrassed. But I'd like to thank everybody for coming. The next History Lecture Series is going to be February 21st, and it's going to be Free People of Color of New Orleans and St. Bernard. The lectures are free and open to the public. the first Monday of each month except for the next one, and with a nice wine and cheese reception starting at 6:30. So please come and bring more friends.